It's not too late. It's not too late.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our third stream of the day. Welcome to the Raise.dev Hacktober Helpdesk. My name is Joe, and I'm here to kick you off for our third and final stream on the very exciting first day of Hacktoberfest. We're going to be joined here shortly by John Britton and the folks from MLH, so I'll leave it to them to introduce you all. But before I do that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's happening here and what you can expect for the next hour or so. So the Raise.dev Hacktoberfest Helpdesk is, as it says on the tin, your resource for Hacktoberfest. So as you've got those questions, or you run into a sticky issue that you can't find a solution to, or you've got a pull request that you just can't get merged, you can submit those questions to us at the Hacktoberfest Helpdesk, and we will find you an expert guest who will be able to review those questions for you and help get those merged. You can find out more info and submit your questions at the raise.dev/Hacktoberfest webpage shown below. And if you are interested in getting notifications when we go live, you can also subscribe to those right there on the show. As I mentioned, for those of you who are new and this is the first show you've tuned into today, we are doing this multiple times a day, all throughout Hacktoberfest, all throughout the month of October. And you can find that full schedule week by week on our Twitch page at twitch.tv/raisedevs/schedule. It does let us put a week up at a time, so you'll be able to find the schedule for tomorrow on there already. And as soon as it hits the weekend, we'll put up the schedule for next week as well. So that just leaves me briefly to say that this has been a very exciting week for us, because not only have we got the Hacktoberfest Helpdesk, we also launched Raise.dev itself earlier in the week. And we're here, much as we are to host this help desk, also to help you in your developer journey. So if you are someone who is learning to code or has learned to code and is now looking for the next step up in your career, whether that is finding a new job, getting a first job, getting a promotion, or changing careers or industries, Raise.dev is here to help. You can apply whilst we're in early access for a free coaching session with our Raise.dev coaches, and they will work with you to set some goals and get you where you need to be in your career. So you can find out more info about that at our main site, raise.dev. So that is everything from me. What I'm going to do now is add your host for this evening, our founder, John Britton, who will kick off the rest of the show. Hope you have a good one. I'll be hanging out in the chat. Please post questions in the chat. We will be getting those to the wonderful guests. We've had a great time with chat for the rest of the day, so I hope that we're able to hang out with you again today as well. And other than that, enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, my name is John Britton. I'm the founder of Raise.dev, and I'm going to be joined today by two really good friends of mine and also amazing people in the developer community, John Gottfried and Mike Swift from Major League Hacking. So hey guys, thanks for joining us.
How's it going?
Thank you. It's going well. How are you doing?
Doing good. Happy to be here.
All right. And how about you, John?
This is awesome. I am so stoked. I've been following some of the other streams earlier today, and I'm excited to be on one now.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you here as guests. Before we get started, I think it'd just be great to have some brief introduction about kind of your background as developers. So maybe you can each kind of introduce yourselves with the story of how you got your first developer job, because so many of the people in our audience are really, they've learned how to code, but they want to find that first job and make the jump. And I think it'd be great to just share just a little bit of your story of how you got into your first job. So maybe Swift, do you want to go first?
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm Swift. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Major League Hacking.
Wait, before we do that, what's Major League Hacking, in case people don't know?
Oh, yeah, totally. So Major League Hacking, we're an organization focused on empowering our next generation of technologists. We plan events and create communities where you can come to gain the skills that you need to launch your career, found a startup, or just bring whatever ideas you might have to life. We help you build your network as well, meet other awesome, like-minded developers and creators. And we're a global community. We've been around for about 7 years now. Probably best known for our work in hackathons, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about a lot because that's a lot about how both of us found some of our early jobs. And in general, MLH has been working primarily with students, but these days we work with people of all different backgrounds and educational levels. And that's MLH.
Cool.
So how did I get my first developer job? So I actually came into being a developer kind of through a side door, I guess is the way I would describe this. Back when I was in high school, I wanted to be a lawyer. And at the time, I was running a landscaping business in my parents' hometown, running around with lawnmowers, cutting grass, that kind of stuff. And, meanwhile...
Entrepreneurial.
Yeah, exactly. I've always been very entrepreneurial in retrospect. And at the time, my friends are working in restaurants and things. And so I thought I had a pretty good gig. But the time came for me to go off to university. And my parents pointed out that I was going to need a new job because you can't really bring a lawnmower with you to a dorm room. My roommate probably would have murdered me in my sleep if I had done that. And I recognized they were right. And I did what any enterprising young student would do. I went on the university's job board. I sorted the jobs by how much they paid. And I applied for every job that paid the most money, indiscriminate what it was. The only one that wrote me back was actually a programming job. And I thought that, surely there must have been some kind of mistake because they would have been better off hiring literally anybody with any programming experience, not me. But thanks to some encouragement from some friends and family, I decided to go in and take the interview. And I went and I told them that, I hadn't really programmed before in my life, but I was interested in computers and I was a hard worker and I would come in every single day and, I would do my best and, try to provide value for them and learn how to be a great coder. And they decided to take a chance on me and hired me to write accounting software, of all things, in PHP. I don't know why
PHP is a great starting point.
It is. I learned a lot of PHP.
I think we all three of us share that, getting our first
PHP
jobs doing PHP back at that was just the thing at the time, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, it was like the JavaScript of its day.
Oh my god, yeah, that's hilarious.
That's a low blow. But yeah, so that's how I got my first job. I think I didn't really take it seriously though. I probably started taking being a developer seriously after I went to my first hackathon. A friend a couple of years later found out I programmed and brought me out to my first hackathon, which sounded like this thing that elite programmers would go to. But he told me that it was welcome for people of all skill levels, and I would have a great time. And I went and walked into this room at NYU in New York, and there had been maybe 100 other students who had given up their weekend of doing things that college students do to come back to school and spend their weekend bringing a crazy idea.
Programs.
Yeah, exactly. And I had never seen anything like it before. I stayed up all night making a project, and when I woke up the next morning, after being exhausted, I looked myself in the mirror and said, that was the best experience of my life. Forget being a lawyer. I want to be a hacker. And so after that, I switched into computer science, and here we are. So
you said something interesting, that they took a chance on you, and this is something that I talk to a lot of people about when they're breaking into a software developer career. It really is like getting that big break, right? And so part of the thing that we're trying to do with Raise.dev is make it so that more people can get that big break, right? I think that one of the most rewarding things about working in the education industry is being the vehicle that gives people that big break, right? So I don't know if you have any more detail that you can share, but like, why did they take a chance on you? Like, who was this person? Did they see something in you? Like, what was it that made them like take a chance? Because obviously you weren't qualified for the job, and I think this is going to be a recurring theme that you don't need to be qualified for the job to get the first job. What you need is a strong amount of motivation, and you need somebody who's willing to take the chance on you. And so it's all about optimizing your likelihood of somebody taking that chance.
Yeah.
But yeah, what made them take that chance on you?
I would like to think that they saw something in me, but the truth is they were probably desperate, if I'm really being honest. But
yeah,
I think it's funny because when I look back on every job I ever had, That job, that first programming job, is the only one I ever got where I didn't personally know somebody who made a connection, helping me to get that job, like doing an introduction.
Yep.
And I think, at the time I went in and I was probably overly honest. And here's the other thing I'll say too. That was a minimum wage job programming.
I was going to ask you about your salary. Yeah.
It was a minimum wage job programming. And let me tell you, they were probably paying the guy who had my job before that like 4 or 5 times as much as I was making. And I had that minimum wage job for probably, I want to say 2 years that I was working basically full time doing it. And so, I think different from most programming jobs today where you're commanding, salaries that frankly are dwarfing, even just like median household income in the US, right? I think, frankly, I was compensated like to learn, right? And I think that's great.
Yeah.
I had an opportunity to learn and earn, which I think is a really powerful thing. But I think they probably just needed somebody to fill the gap. And I was in the right place at the right time. And I was honest and willing to work for, basically scraps to make it work. But I did it, I did it.
So I want to talk about that salary point. So my first experience as a developer, I was studying in university and we had like an incubator on campus. And I had gotten into writing PHP apps. And I built this website. Actually, it was a photo sharing website for me and my friends during college before Facebook, right? And it actually had like, I would say a lot of users, like all of my friends used it. And we all posted our photos. And it was when Facebook came to our campus, like traffic to my website just collapsed. So thanks Zuck, right? But anyways, I had been building like silly apps and stuff. We actually had like a games section where you could go and play like Snake and stuff and you could have a high score. It was really fun. Because we weren't like doing schoolwork, we were just hanging out. But I got this job at the local the school incubator, and I worked for this company that sold PHP software as boxed software. Like we live in this era of like SaaS now, where everybody like buys software online and it's a subscription based off the number of seats or the number of users or something like that. These people were selling PHP software that you could download, and then you could install it on your own server and run a job board like Craigslist or run all these different things. And I was doing basically like, I built a live chat system and I also like did tech support for them. And similar to you, it was the lowest paying job of my entire life. I had worked in other jobs prior to that. I worked in construction. I did hardwood flooring. I worked at a ski resort doing, working on the mountain and stuff like that. And I made more money doing those jobs than I did in my first programming job. It's funny. I had to work 2 jobs while I was in school to like afford to pay for everything. And I worked at Pizza Hut at night. So I'd go to class sometimes, and then I go to my incubator job during the day, and then in the evenings I go work at Pizza Hut and deliver pizzas. And I made, almost double what I made at my software job delivering pizzas. So I could definitely relate to what you're saying about the, just take what you can get at the beginning. And I think things have changed these days. I don't think that you can, that's the way of the world right now. But back when like being a web engineer at least wasn't that as common as it is now. Yeah. Some of them didn't like really pay very much because it was almost like a job people didn't know that they needed to hire for. So John, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'll say there, but just before we get off that is like, I think there's a big difference between taking a salary that's less than what you're worth and taking the minimum wage salary when, you're really legitimately just getting started out, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
I was not being underpaid by any. I don't want to ever.
Oh no, I was totally unqualified. So actually, I have to go back to this. So they had the job postings like be a PHP developer, and they were like, "Do you know PHP?" I was like, "Yes, I definitely know PHP." You know why I knew PHP? Because I bought a book. It was called Sam's Teach Yourself PHP in 24 Hours, and I read it straight through in one sitting, and then I said I knew PHP.
Yep.
I did not know PHP.
The same book that I sat on my desk when I had my first programming job. That's the book I was reading to teach myself.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with you though. I was totally unqualified for the job at the time, and like they were taking a chance on me and saying, it wasn't a very big chance because they weren't paying very much, but they could have hired somebody else. How about you, John? What was your entry into software development, and like what can maybe some of the viewers take from it, as they're getting into their first jobs, if that's the case?
So I think we're kind of like 2 different entry points. As a kid, like even as young as elementary school, I remember using this hosting service that AOL had called AOL Homepages, where they would let you host like HTML websites. And I remember like making these websites about like Harry Potter and stuff like that, an 8-year-old is obsessed with. And that was kind of like my entry point into learning to code. And Similar to you guys, like I read a lot of books about it. I remember the like Idiot's Guides were really popular, like Learn in 24 Hours, some of the O'Reilly books, but those were kind of over my head. And I kind of got like a reputation, which I think a lot of kids get in middle school, to be like the computer kid, which meant that any of my parents' friends who like needed a website, like paid me like, you know, $50 to make them a website. And so I started doing a lot of that, like weird, like kind of obscure websites for local businesses and stuff. And basically, like, once I was old enough to legally have a job, I was in my high school's like guidance counselor office, and there was like a Post-it tacked to a corkboard that said, looking for like techie kid to help. And like, I literally called them. My mom drove me to the interview. And it was just
great.
like a local business.
Mom drove you to the interview.
Yeah, I couldn't drive.
Classic.
It was like a local business that sold industrial like machinery. So like CNC routers and thermoformers and like stuff like that. And they had a whole warehouse, and they had a front office. And I would go in after school every day to the front office and work on their website, which previously I think was in Perl, and I rewrote in PHP. And that was really like my first legit programming job. But there were no other developers, and no one else on the team was remotely technical. So it was like some parts writing code and some parts installing Word on like the secretary's computer. And then when I went to college, I started off studying computer science. I realized within one semester that I absolutely hated it from an academic standpoint. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, it was much more theory than the practice, which is kind of what I enjoyed. And I think a lot of people share that. So I switched majors to history, decided I was going to be a high school history teacher, and then promptly got mono and dropped out of school for a semester.
Oh man, that was so terrible.
And this is kind of a life-changing moment. If I hadn't gotten mono, I'd probably be a history teacher right now, because I felt better. I was at home in like suburban New York, bored out of my mind because all of my friends were away at school. So I was hanging out with my parents constantly. And I started like trolling Craigslist for like a job, like something to do. And I knew that like I could get paid more as a programmer, like maybe slightly above minimum wage, right? Like $15 an hour instead of like $7 an hour or something. And I applied for a job that I saw that was literally one block from my parents' house. And that was the main reason I applied for it. And it turned out that this is kind of where our stories intersect, because at that time, John Britton here, or I guess over here, was, I think, the only developer on that team, and was the one who interviewed me for that job. And so that, for me, was also kind of the only job I ever had where I didn't get a referral. Like, I literally sent a cold email to someone on Craigslist, which, looking back on it, like, probably the only constructive thing that's ever come of Craigslist. Like, so, you know, I got that job, and ever since then, it's always been through network. A lot of them were referred by you, John, or other people that I knew. And, you know, I think... you could probably talk more than I can about why I was hired for that job. I mean, I don't know. I felt like I was a very novice developer. I'd never worked alongside any other developers before, so I didn't have any like culture or habits. I really just had my own like trial and error experience.
Yeah. Okay. So you said another thing that was interesting. When you took that that job in the mechanicals like place, how did you fit in with the team? Were there other engineers involved? Like, was it just you? Like, what was the
makeup of the team? It was there was one guy, his nephew, his friend, and then some woman they hired as secretary. And that was the entire team. And then like someone who worked in the warehouse. So it was like 5 people. They were all 5 times my age. You know, they were in like their 50s, probably 60s, maybe. And I had nothing in common with them. They were super nice and honestly gave me an immense amount of like trust and leeway for like a 15-year-old who had never had a job before. And, I think I'll say this like straight up, like, I didn't learn anything from them as individuals about programming. I learned a lot from them about like general small business, how it runs, how decisions are made, how to assess someone's needs and kind of like architect a website for those needs, how to communicate with customers. But none of them had any clue about programming at all. They had previously had another high school kid who worked with them who built a lot of the like stuff before I got there, but I never talked to or met him.
Yeah. So coming into that job interview afterwards, where I was the one interviewing, I think that this is really interesting that we can kind of look at it from both sides. I was also totally unqualified at that point. I had actually just taken that job. I left college. I was in a computer science degree. I left college, and the reason I left college was I was paying for school myself. I was working 2 jobs. I had some scholarships. The scholarships ran out, and it was pay $50,000 to finish my degree or get paid to get a job. And so I got that first job offer, and I just basically said, like, okay, it's smarter for me to go work and get paid than to go into more debt for university. And so I was there, and they kind of gave me the leeway like you were just talking about. And I think this is an interesting parallel. I felt that in my career as a developer, I've shifted between like 2 types of teams that I've been on. And I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. I think they're both good at different times in your career. But I've been in teams where, like you said, there are no other tech people there, right? There's no engineers. It's just me solving a problem for a business that needs a problem solved. And there's a lot of like leeway and a lot of chances to make mistakes and figure things out for the first time. But also you don't like know the right way, right? Or you don't know the tried and true way. And so the flip side of that is working on teams where there's a lot of people who are much more skilled and experienced than you. So in that case with the job where we worked together before, I was kind of the only tech person there at the time, and they gave me total leeway to hire whoever I wanted, right? And so we ended up hiring you. And it was mostly because of the motivation, right? Like I remember distinctly there was a team, there were a few people that we hired, and each person had one distinct kind of trait that set them apart from the rest of the applicants. And in your case, we had a coding challenge. We gave you the coding challenge. We said you have 24 hours to return the coding challenge. You lived right down the street. You walked home. You solved the challenge. It was back to me within like 2 hours, right? It was really, really quick. And so I was like, this guy gets stuff done. I think we should take a chance on him. I don't know what I'm doing anyways. He'll probably be better. So we ended up bringing you in that way. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think what we ought to do now is kind of shift gears into Hacktoberfest. So this is the Hacktoberfest help desk. We are here to help anybody who's participating in Hacktoberfest get help with contributing to open source or becoming a developer. But let's start with what is Hacktoberfest. So I can share a little bit about Hacktoberfest, how it came to be. So the folks at DigitalOcean started this thing maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I don't remember exactly at this point, but it was just an idea to kind of celebrate open source and create a fun, inviting atmosphere for people to get involved. The idea being that we could make it more welcoming for people who haven't been in open source before to get into writing code and sharing, because it can be really daunting. The first time you go to contribute to open source, you're worried, is your code going to be good enough? Are they going to accept it? Is somebody going to tell you that you did everything wrong? And by having people that are in the community hosting open source projects that want contributions and are welcoming new contributors, it makes it just that much more compelling for people to get involved. So every year during October, there's this month-long kind of event where open source projects welcome new contributors, and kind of a bunch of people go out of their way to help each other out, and hopefully many people get into open source for the first time or continue bringing new people in. So this year, Hacktoberfest is, I think it's its 7th year, and we are planning to, just help as many people as possible get in and solve their problems. So that's why we're here. I'm here. I just want to help anybody who wants to get into open source. But I know that you all have been involved in open source as well, or in Hacktoberfest as well. What got you involved with Hacktoberfest, and why do you think that it's a good use of time? Why do you participate in Hacktoberfest?
John, you want to go first?
Sure. I think that when I look back on how I became a developer, open source in the way it exists now wasn't quite as much of a thing. There was a lot of open source software, but my main interaction with like other people's code was from like Googling and finding what they used to call like snippets on different websites I could copy and paste. And, you know, I put up some of my own websites with code snippets as well. And I think that act of like sharing and learning by both how other people wrote code and how I could emulate them and improve on it was a really valuable exercise. And I think open source shares a lot of that in you know, kind of a philosophical sense. And so Hacktoberfest as an event, I think is really cool because it not only gives people permission to start being junior contributors, but also creates some infrastructure to incentivize them to do so. And, you know, I think that sometimes people do need a push in that direction. So when we partner with Hacktoberfest, you know, as MLH and both personally, our goal is to help create community around it. Like we have a platform called Organizer HQ where local organizers in our community all over the world can host events, right, for their peers. We partnered with Hacktoberfest to make it easier for anyone, anywhere in the world, to band their community together and host an event. Obviously, right now, those events are, you know, virtual, but it's still the idea that you can learn from people around you, you can make connections with people around you, and that both the interpersonal and the like peer learning aspects are really important and are kind of like intrinsic qualities of open source.
Excellent. And how about you, Swift? Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, you know, I think for me, Hacktoberfest is this event that, you know, frankly, I would have loved to be a part of when I was first getting started as a developer, right? I think, you know, similar to what John said, right? Open source, you know, has become really important in my life now. But, you know, back when I got started, it was kind of this big mystery black box to me, right? That I just didn't understand. And I don't think that's actually changed for most people, you know, getting started in their career today either. I mean, we do this census that we send out to our entire community at MLH twice a year, about 100,000 people going out to our events, and we sample, you know, them with surveys about, you know, all kinds of things that they're interested in. And one of the sets of questions we asked this time around in preparation for Hacktoberfest was about open source in particular. And, you know, the first question we asked was, have you actually ever contributed to open source? And, you know, these are people who are going out to hackathons every weekend. They're attending, you know, hands-on skill-based workshops. They may be early in their career, but they're really talented people. And only about 28% of people actually had contributed to open source in any way up to that point, which I thought was incredibly surprising on its own, given how much open source is basically the foundation for everybody, you know, the software they're building, right? On top of that, 62% of people, you know, were saying that they wanted to contribute open source, but just hadn't yet. So we asked them, you know, a follow-up question, which is, what's actually been holding you back from contributing to open source? Like, why aren't you actually, you know, contributing right now? And 65% of people said that the main reasons they weren't contributing to open source was because either they didn't know where to get started or they felt like they weren't skilled enough yet. And I think those two sentiments are extremely reflective of where I was at the beginning of my career. And I think events like Hacktoberfest, you know, frankly, combat that, right? They take these things that are actually common misconceptions and, you know, address them and put them in the spotlight. I mean, first and foremost, like not knowing where to get started, like the whole point of Hacktoberfest is to basically help people figure out where to get going, right? Like things like, you know, mobilizing people towards good first issues or like educating them around basics of open source, around how to go and find those things that you can do. I mean, my first contributions to open source were basically typo corrections, you know, nothing crazy, but they, you know, they're merged. They're in code that's somewhere on the internet these days. And, you know, not being skilled enough, like, I think that comes back to the same thing, right? It's like, you know, there's all kinds of things you can do to make the open source world better. And I think we as MLH and we as a community have an obligation to help train our next generation of great open source citizens. And I think that starts by, you know, helping new people get involved, a diverse group of people, and also educating them around, you know, best practices and, you know, maybe combating some of those misconceptions that kept people like all of us out of open source in the first place.
So I spend a lot of time talking to developers, and, you know, I talk to people who are entering their careers, who are just coming up, and I also talk to people that are very experienced. And when I talk to the people that are very experienced developers, they say something that you just said, Swift. They say it very frequently. And they say, I wish something like this was around when I was coming up. And I think that, you know, John, I've heard you say that. Swift, I've heard you say it. And like talking about Hacktoberfest, I can definitely agree it's the same story for me. I think that also like MLH is another example of that. there's so many of these, you can look at Codecademy or any of these online, resources. There's so much out there these days that makes the barrier to entry, easier. So I think that, as far as timing to become a developer, there's never been a better time than now in terms of the on-ramp. And, when we're creating products or programs, I always am thinking about it the same way, where it's like, this is something that it's all informed by the things I wish I had when I was coming up as a developer. So the idea behind Raise.dev, the way our program is structured is you're matched as a developer with a coach and you work on some real world project. We don't have a curriculum. We don't have set classes or anything like that. It's just hands-on doing real work and getting help from somebody nearby. And the idea to have that person to go to is just, you don't know what you don't know. And without being able to ask them, without having somebody to ask, you're just kind of on your own, right? So I like you said that, and it just made me like, have that like same mindset of, yeah, I wish this existed when I was younger, when I was getting into this stuff. And one program that did exist, and I want to talk about getting into open source for the first time a little bit with both of you. How did you get into open source for the first time? So my first experience with open source was actually from this program from Google called the Google Summer of Code. It's a very famous program, and similar to like how John was saying, that one kind of instance kind of changed his whole trajectory. Swift, you getting that job, it changed your whole trajectory. For me, Google Summer of Code was kind of the thing that changed my trajectory in terms of open source and really becoming a developer. It feels weird to say it, but actually the money from Google Summer of Code is what motivated me in the beginning. It was a $5,000 stipend that you got paid for working on open source over the summer. And as a college student who was working 2 jobs to pay my tuition, $5,000 was a lot of money for me. And the idea that I could work on open source and like get some experience like producing code that was used by many, many people and get paid for it was like really compelling. So in, I want to say it was like 2007, I applied to Google Summer of Code and I got rejected. And it was kind of heartbreaking. And the way their application process works is it's basically the open source maintainer chooses who gets in and who doesn't. Google chooses the open source maintainers and the open source maintainers choose the people. And, I was determined to get accepted. And so I started talking to those open source maintainers over the next year. And I started to actually contribute to, I made my first open source contribution outside of Google Summer of Code to that same project during the year from when I got rejected to the following summer, 2008, when I got accepted. And so that following summer, I got into open source and I started doing it for the Google Summer of Code. I'd love to hear your stories of like, what was your first open source contribution and how did that happen?
I mean,
John.
John.
Okay. I'm going to call on you guys so it's easier.
There you go. I like it.
So I actually, Joe, who introduced us all at the beginning, I apparently dug up my first public open source contribution on GitHub, which we can actually see here. It's really sad because it didn't get merged. And, I think I worked on other people's projects and contributed to them long before this. But this is definitely like the first public artifact on GitHub of a pull request I submitted. And at the time, I believe I was working for Twilio as a developer evangelist. I was going to a lot of hackathons and I started experimenting with drones, specifically like the Parrot AR drones that were really popular. And I had been hacking on them. And what became really popular right around that time was a lot of JavaScript robotics. So I wrote this pull request to what's called Node AR Drone, which is a Node library to control AR drones. And I believe I had written this alongside a project that Swift and I created that would hijack a fleet of AR drones and like take over control of them, kind of like a drone virus. And I wrote this code. It's totally fine code. Like basically all it does is set up callbacks for things that the drone did. So a callback for when it lands or when it took off. And it's like very, very, I guarantee you I copied and pasted this code and changed the variable names, and that's how I got it to work. And it works. It's fine. It was functional. But the most interesting thing I think about it is like I submitted it, and the immediate response, literally the same day I submitted it, was, looks pretty good, but no tests. So, hold off. And then they eventually closed it like a year later. And I think that the only reason I bring this up is I actually think that's a really common experience for people in open source. Now, I knew Felix, who's the guy who reviewed my pull request personally, and no hard feelings. He's a good guy, but a lot of people submit pull requests on things that they think are interesting or improvements or whatever, and they get rejected. They don't really understand why. They don't really understand how to get it in there, and it dissuades people from open source. And so going back to Hacktoberfest, I actually think that part of the value of events and programs like that, whether it's Hacktoberfest or Google Summer of Code or, the MLH Fellowship or whatever else, is that you're kind of priming maintainers to be in the mindset of teaching. And whether that's going through and selecting a bunch of good first issues, or whether it's giving more in-depth feedback and review on a pull request, I actually think that is a huge barrier that most people run into that dissuades them from continuing to be involved with open source, that those programs do help with. And in this case, yes, I could have gone back and added tests. I don't really remember why I didn't, but I think there's a million situations where, people don't really understand what happened.
So while you were saying that, since we had your first issue, I tried to Google my first contribution to open source as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it because it was in a subversion repository for Gallery 2, which was hosted by SourceForge, and it appears is no longer online. If anybody can find that and post a link to that in the chat, we'd really love it. I definitely like looking at those retro first issues. In terms of the concept, the problem of getting turned away, I want to talk about what it's like as a developer to get into open source and to be turned away from the maintainer, and try to put yourself in the maintainer's shoes when that happens, right? A maintainer's job is really hard. They're creating this project, it's their passion. On the side, they might have a real job, that has nothing to do with this project, and they give it to the world and they say, thank you, or here's this thing, use it, it's free to use, and the world thanks them by saying there's a million things wrong with it, fix this bug, it doesn't work, and everybody's just banging on their door telling them how everything is wrong with their software. And I think that the mindset that mindset is just not correct, and we have to be really careful about expecting out of maintainers. But there are so many maintainers that just love new contributors and want to give back and help. And so, like you said, with the fellowship, there's tons of people who are signed up, and tons of maintainers that are just happy to be, giving back. But I want to talk about the, what to do when that happens, right? And why does it happen? So, in your case, you were kind of fine to just let the thing go. In my case, my first open source contribution was, that gallery project I was talking about. And then I did the Summer of Code project. And I spent my entire summer on it. And frankly, I didn't do a great job, right? I wasn't very skilled. I just kind of worked really hard to get into the program. I put my time into it. It gave me the right exposure. But as far as the maintainer, what they got out of it, I feel like these programs often sell the maintainer on if you do this, you'll get lots of contributions, right? And really that doesn't happen. You get lots of mediocre, sometimes some good contributions, and some of them are just unmergeable for various reasons. But what you do get is somebody who's now contributing to open source in the more broad sense. They're just connected, keep going. They might create their own projects in the future. So it's more of if you're looking at this from trying to get more work done, it's not necessarily the right path. But if it's I want to build a community and make a richer open source community for everybody, that's a really good angle for the open source maintainer. Anyways, so I spent this whole summer working on the project, and I did all right, but I didn't do great. And ultimately it didn't get merged, right? I spent this whole summer working on a project, I wrote code, and it never got merged. And it was kind of a bummer for me. But also if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't have continued down the route of open source and all that stuff. So I don't think it was a total loss. But what would you recommend to developers who are getting into open source to try to avoid that situation? How can they not send a pull request that just gets closed immediately with no comment? How can they make sure that they're doing the right thing? Do you have any advice? JG?
Sure. I was going to let Swift chime in there, but I think communication is part of it. It is sometimes So there's a couple of different kinds of pull requests, right? Like, let's back up a little bit. There are some that are issues that are already scoped out or described on a repository that you could do, right? Like maybe it's a feature request, maybe it's a bug fix. Some of them are like more like an RFP or an RFC, where it's like, hey, I have this vague idea. Like, does someone want to propose how to solve it? And then other ones are probably self-discovered, right? Like, I have this feature I wanted, or I have this bug I noticed and wanted to fix. I think that in the case of the first two, where the maintainer or another contributor might be the one soliciting it, I think communication can help a lot. Like, most maintainers, especially on big projects these days, have a Slack or a Discord or maybe still an IRC channel, I don't know, where you can actually contact them and talk about how you want to contribute, and they can give you a little bit more guidance. I know that, like, in the MLH fellowship, like, we specifically have like opened lines of communication between the students and the maintainers so that they can talk through some of the scope and how to approach something. And there are other, mechanisms in place to help them with that, which I think we'll talk about probably later. But I think communicating with maintainer helps a lot. The other thing is, for repositories that have contributor guidelines or recommendations, read those thoroughly and make sure you understand them. And put in some time to look at other pull requests that did get accepted, right? Like, how did they describe their change? What kind of feedback did they get? How was the review process structured? And try to emulate that or prepare for it, because, it's a really variable experience, right? Like, I think one of the hardest things to figure out is how different it can be from one open source project to another.
Yep. Yeah, open source is definitely opinionated. And I think the best advice is like the contributing guidelines. Most well-maintained projects will have some kind of contributing guidelines. And they might say something in there like, all we want to do is look at your code. If you have an idea for a feature, make the code and we'll evaluate your pull request. Other maintainers might prefer that if you're suggesting a new feature or a new way to change the way that the software works, that you propose it in an issue first and like discuss the approach, so that you're more likely to use an approach that will be accepted by the maintainer and will be up to their standards. So definitely, each one is different. So going to Swift, maybe you can share a little bit about your first contribution to open source as well.
I think the question is, what do you consider the first contribution to open source? Because,
well, how about this? What is contributing to open source, right? Like, what does it mean to contribute to open source?
I think it's a really interesting question, right? And like, I think traditionally when people say that, what they mean is that they are either publishing something that is free code that other people can use, that's publicly available, or they are in some way contributing value to existing public code that's somewhere on the internet, right? That people can theoretically access. Traditionally, I think that happens on GitHub. People come there. I mean, it could be SourceForge back in the day, or a variety of other places where code is hosted. But it could be something like, most people, when they probably think of open source, they think about like actually merging a pull request into something like that, right? But I think there's other things that people can do too, right? Like, they can close issues, open issues, comment on them. They can do some level of community management. They could, honestly, if you were going to ask me what I think my first open source contributions were, and I don't think that this is traditional by any stretch of imagination, but I spent an inordinate amount of time on Stack Overflow when I was learning how to code, answering other people's questions. And in a lot of ways, Stack Overflow is an open source repository of answers, with questions and answers, right? It's, maybe not the traditional idea of software that's publicly available on the internet for people to use, but in a lot of ways, like the code snippets that are published on Stack Overflow are open source, right? They're like pieces of code that people can pull in and use. I think, the place I started really contributing to open source was by the time I ended up, at SendGrid. My first job out of school was I was working as a developer advocate, and I'd made some minor contributions to open source before that, like some issues that got merged. I did a little bit of work at my previous tech job before that, but like, that's when I really got into open source. And what I was doing then is I was going out to maintainers who had projects that I felt like could benefit from having additional hands on deck, and I was volunteering my time to work with them and close issues and contribute code. I became a maintainer for a project for the first time then as well. But I think for me, like, my journey was kind of convoluted. Like, I think probably of my first 5 or 6 pull requests, all of them got closed. I don't think one got merged for probably like 2 or 3 years after I joined GitHub. And, I think at the end of the day, I would still have thought of myself as contributing to open source before that, but just because it didn't get merged didn't mean it wasn't, successfully participating in the community in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I actually have a thought about that I think is kind of something cool that you touched on, that like open source doesn't necessarily mean that you're contributing to like a huge well-known repo. Like when I think back, I wrote a lot of code that ended up in blog posts or tutorials or screencasts that was technically open source and was designed to help other developers, but wasn't part of a established open source repository. And it's kind of a weird distinction, but like a lot of developers are getting into open source because they either A, want to help other developers, or B, want to help other developers and also like bolster their portfolio. And I think there are a lot of ways to do that are open and public and helpful without being like a pull request to a major open source repo with 10,000 stars.
I totally agree with that. I mean, honestly, if you want to like really get down to what I think my first actual, like what you would consider a traditional open source contribution was, when I was in school, one of the computer science like homework assignments was implementing a direct map cache. So basically like showing how caching, like least recently used and most recently used caching systems were built under the hood. I wrote it and solved the problem. And I thought it was a pretty neat piece of code. And, back in the day, I didn't really think anything around, the implications of publishing solutions to, academic programming assignments on the internet. But I published it on GitHub in 2010, or maybe 11. That would be a decade ago at this point. And it was not code that existed before the internet. And it was, a solution that I wrote. But that was for a very long time my most popular repository on GitHub with, like 11 stars or something like that, because I guarantee you people would get assigned that programming assignment in class and they'd go and look and see what I did.
Yeah. So I want to go to the topic you said about it's not just code. So open source isn't just code. A good part of what we talk about in open source is code, but there's so much more that goes into it. And I actually think this is a problem in the open source kind of ecosystem in general, is that we don't recognize non-code contributions the same way that we recognize coded contributions. If you look at like on GitHub on your profile, you've got all those little green tiles that show you how much open source you're doing, which are gamification and like some of the negative ways. And it doesn't give you credit if you host a meetup and teach somebody about coding. It doesn't give you credit if you triage issues. It doesn't give you credit if you close an issue or you give a really nice comment. Like there's a lot of stuff that you can do in open source that isn't just writing code. What are some of the other, like obviously there's like issue triage and whatnot, but are there programs like similar to like Google Summer of Code, like or the Fellowship? Have you heard of any programs? This is like an honest question. I don't know if anything like this exists, but have you heard of any programs that are related to contributing to open source in like not a code way? Have you heard of anything like that?
It's funny. I don't know of any, but I talked to like tons and tons of maintainers of like everything from like massive projects to tiny ones when we were preparing for the MLH Fellowship. And every single one of them was like, hey, like, do you know anyone that can help me with my docs and tutorials? Like, yeah. I think a lot of times that is like, not only do people not get recognized for that, but I don't think that there is a really established like community or best practices for how those people can get involved either. And frankly, like from a personal standpoint, I am a way better tutorial writer than I am a developer. Like when I was at Twilio, my most productive work was in like blogging, screencasts, educational content, tutorials, like speaking, and definitely not in writing code.
So one of the things we were thinking about for this semester, so a change we made for the MLH Fellowship, and just like background for anybody who might not know what this is, at the beginning of the summer we launched this thing in partnership with RaiseDev, GitHub, Facebook, a whole bunch of other organizations to help students who had lost their jobs or internships due to COVID have an alternative for the summer where instead of working for a single company, they contributed to open source software under the guidance of professional mentors provided by RaiseDev. And we had a really successful summer with about 150 people going through the program, they leveled up like crazy, and we got contributions merged into some of the most popular and prolific projects on the internet. Things like React and Homebrew. It's really, really cool. Mm-hmm. And we relaunched the program this fall as a continuous program. And the kind of the philosophy that we've had with it is, if learning to code is getting from 0 to 1, we want the fellowship to help you get from 1 to 100, which is learning all the skills that you need, from knowing how to solve a problem to actually being able to do that well enough to get an actual job, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we've done a really good job of laying out some basic programs around that. So one started focused on helping people build their portfolio, and another one helping them get experience working on like real projects from companies. But there's this other idea that I had that I really wanted to do that is actually rooted in a different program we had at MOH that I think we may launch in the future. I've really been thinking about this, but I wanted to create a branch of the fellowship focused on teaching people who were aspiring developer advocates the skills that they needed to actually go out and do that too, right? We have a program at MOH called the Coaches Program, where we effectively hire amazing community leaders from the Major League Hacking community and train them on how to actually go out and represent MOH and our customers out at events, and to empower hackers by working with them directly. And a lot of the skills that people learn there, they leverage into careers in DevRel down the road. And I think that the fellowship presents a really unique opportunity, because not only can we bring in some really amazing experts in developer relations who are focusing on these things in open source that we may not think of as traditional, like merging a pull request in, things like writing documentation, sample apps, like those kinds of things. But I think we could really easily create this kind of opportunity for people to get practical experience with an educational structure. And, it's really closely coupled and related to the work that our fellows are already doing. And I didn't get a chance to launch it this fall, but I really do want to launch that in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, so in this like same space, like I've heard of like doc sprints, and a couple
Read
other,
the Docs is another org.
Read the Docs. Like there's definitely some things out there that are focused on how to get people involved in open source. It's not just code. I also think about things like design, and how typically open source software looks a lot worse than what do you call it, like
Yes.
like paid software. Closed source. I'm like, it's not just that it's closed source. It's like usually when it's available for free, it looks a lot worse than if it's paid. And I think that like the whole open source community could like benefit a lot from trying to like make design and that kind of stuff more like more welcome and more encouraged to improve the software. But what I will say about this is that I think that the best open source projects out there are the ones that do all the non-code stuff right. Like you can have a project that's like 100% awesome, best code ever, and like does the community part wrong, and it or doesn't do it as well, and it's really hard. I don't want to like specify any projects that are bad, but there are definitely projects that are notorious for being very, very highly technical and hard to break into, and almost like the maintainers will yell at you if you do something wrong, and very unwelcoming. And like I don't think it has to be that way. I think that the best projects are the ones that are they write great contributor guides. They have subcommittees or subgroups focused on documentation, on design, on customer service, on all these different things, and try to run it like an organization that's really well distributed. And with that, I wanted to ask you about if you had any favorite open source projects. So somebody in the chat was asking about this, and I have my own favorite projects, but I want to hear about yours and why are they your favorites?
So this is actually a really good transition from that point you just made. So my current favorite open source project, the one that I am loving, over the last few months, is Next.js, which is a framework built on top of React. Now,
so can you tell us what does Next.js do? I want to also like try to say we can be a little technical here. So like, give me your best like in the technical kind of weeds explanation of what Next.js is.
So I will, but let me. I'll give you the kind of longer version of that. And why. So. My background professionally as a programmer is writing Ruby on Rails applications. Now, people have hated on Ruby on Rails forever, for as long as I've been a Rails programmer, because it specifies convention over configuration as a philosophical underlying determining factor, right? So what that means is if you give me a Rails app, like you hand me one off the shelf, I know exactly how to read it, because every Rails app has the same underlying structure to it. They all have the same folder directories. They all have the same conventions for where we put things, how we name them, where they show up. It makes handing bringing in new developers or handing off code really easy because it is exactly the same for everyone. That is not true for a lot of other languages. And one of the most notoriously bad at that is JavaScript. Frankly, all three of us could write a JavaScript app in Node and try to hand it off to the other person. And it's highly likely that we would each use a completely different style, a completely different structure, completely different tools. And it would be really difficult to actually understand how they all worked, without having to spend a substantial amount of time reading the code for all of them. Now, as you can imagine, JavaScript is eclipsing almost every other programming language as the most popular language.
It's the most popular by far for
by
a while.
Magnitude.
Yeah.
It's real. I saw this graph the other day of
Projects on GitHub.
Yeah, projects on GitHub by language, and JavaScript is just like
dwarfs everything.
TypeScript is like eating some JavaScript.
Oh yeah. That's
really
true. I mean, I lump those together.
I know, but as part of that, we've had some frameworks that come out that are specifically focused on helping to create a better experience when we're interacting with UI elements. So when I first got started programming, if you wanted to manipulate the DOM or change a web page, you would use raw jQuery. So you would basically be creating these little snippets of HTML, and you'd be using methods like replace, or you'd be setting inner HTML, like those kinds of things with effectively strings to do that.
Yeah.
Now React came along with a lot of other popular JavaScript frameworks, and they basically became libraries that are designed to help us more easily interact with UI elements in JavaScript. They're not necessarily full stack. In fact, React, as it was first created, was meant to be primarily used in the browser as a front-end interface, helping us to do those visual UI changes on web pages. Now, obviously, with Node.js, JavaScript can be used both in the front end and the back end. And of course, programmers who were using Node in the back and React in the front wanted to figure out how to put those things together. And so for a long time, there was a lot of what I call the glue and toothpicks mechanisms, where people would try to render React like components basically on the back end and serve them the same way you would traditionally serve back end code. Well, Next.js is a framework that's written on top of React that has, and this is where my background as a Rails programmer really starts to shine. It has a lot of convention over configuration built into it around how it's laid out, what goes where, and how it actually renders. And it actually couples both front-end code and back-end code, specifically React. And so you can use all of your favorite Node.js tools across both the front end and the back end, and rely on some of the convention that is designed by the people who make Next, which is this company Vercel. And you get a lot of speed performance increases, as well as just like general developer happiness. But now coming back to the original point and why I think this is really good tie-in here is, you said, some of the best open source repos, the most popular ones, are that way because they do a great job of making it really easy to get some of those softer, things that we wouldn't necessarily count as traditional open source, contributions. And one of the things I love about Next is that in the main GitHub repo on the master branch of Next.js, there's an examples folder that the team maintains that has examples of every possible integration that you could want to do with Next.js. And they maintain them at the same quality that they would maintain actual code that's being used in the underlying library. And
awesome.
When you're trying to get started with something like, let's imagine you wanted to add a database to your Next.js app. Well, all you need to do is open up that examples folder, and they've got every database you could possibly want in there. Prisma, Mongoose, whatever. If you wanted to add a CMS, they've got those in there. You can figure out how to use Contentful or whatever your favorite one is. And they have, traditionally a huge problem in open source is example applications becoming outdated. I can't tell you how many times I've been looking at a tutorial and realized that the code in the tutorial just doesn't work because it's 4 years old and nobody ever bothered to update it. But closely integrating those examples into the actual core repository makes that a lot easier, because you could track changes. And when the team responsible for writing the library is also responsible for the examples, you just get a much better developer experience. So yeah, so right now my favorite is Next.js. I think I'll always be a Ruby programmer. I'm not going to lie about that, but I've been writing a lot of JavaScript and TypeScript recently, and Next is my go-to. And that examples folder is just like the best thing since sliced bread.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thanks, Swift. How about you, John? What's your favorite open source project and why?
I'm also a huge fan of Rails. I do think that one of the projects I consistently go back to that's not Rails is Sinatra, or Flask if you use Python. I think that I got my start doing web development in PHP and HTML. And one of the magical things, you can talk for a long time about all the problems of PHP development, especially 10 years ago. Now it's a lot better. But one of the magical things is you can have like a single file that is your simple application. And while that is not like great architecture for an application at scale, it's a really good entry point if you're just starting out. Because I think one of the hardest things to wrap your head around as a new developer is like how the front end and the back end and all these different pieces actually connect together. And I think Sinatra and Flask do a really good job of making that like as simple as humanly possible. In addition to those, and this one's a little bit more esoteric, there's this Ruby gem that I've used for a really long time, sadly in maintenance mode now, called Backup. And it's incredible because it is a like full DSL, domain specific language, which is like a way of structuring instructions or configuration in a specific way. So it's a full DSL for system backups. So you can write Ruby that does nightly backups of certain folders and compresses them and exports a SQL database and puts it on Amazon S3 and like whatever. It runs on Linux and Mac. I've used it for years on all of my like random projects that have like consistent uploads or updates or things like that. And it was just like incredibly simple, really well designed. Like it just worked. It was well documented. And I fell in love with it and have used it for years. And yeah, huge fan of things like that are like specific utilities or solutions that are just really, really well thought out.
Yeah. So when we were talking about the, all the extra stuff outside of just the code and how the best open source projects have this stuff really well, I wanted to make the point also that when you're building software for other developers, generally like frameworks or APIs, there usually aren't kind of user interfaces. It's mostly the command line and whatnot. And in that case, your docs are basically your UI, right? Like, so having good docs, having good examples, that's the same kind of quality level that we're talking about is like having a good design in commercial software is equivalent to like in developer tools, having good docs and having them be up to date and having them be complete and accurate. So, that's a good thing to focus on. For me, in terms of like favorite open source projects, there are like so many projects that I use all the time. I love them. I can't like survive without open source. There's lots and lots of little ones that are like minor tweaks to my daily workflows. But the one that I think is most amazing, my favorite project of all is Homebrew. So I run a Mac, for my development environment, for my day-to-day computing. I have one over here, I've got another over here. And I do this thing where I script everything on my machine so that when I get a brand new machine from Apple, or if I reformat my computer and install Mac OS, I run one command. It goes onto my GitHub account, finds a repository called .files, and that's an open source repository. So if you want to have a computer that works just like mine, you can go there and grab those .files. You run one command. It downloads every piece of software that I use in my daily development flow. It installs all that software. It configures my machine. It sets up development servers. It runs background, like it runs Nginx for me. It runs PostgreSQL. It runs Redis, like everything. It's just all there. And Homebrew, the reason it's my favorite piece of software is when I got into Linux for the first time, my first flavor of Linux that I used was Gentoo Linux. And if you're not familiar with Gentoo Linux, it has this package manager called emerge. And what it does is it takes any package that you want to install, and it goes and it fetches the source code of that package, and then it compiles it locally on your machine according to your compiler flags. So, hardcore people who are really into this stuff would say that those machines are faster because it's compiled exactly for the architecture on your machine with all the flags on that you want and all the flags off that you want. But it's like way more work to configure, and it's super confusing. But I didn't know what a package manager was when I started using Linux. And so I thought emerge was just this thing that was part of Linux, and that was just the way it was. And it took hours and hours and hours to install things. Come along and I find Ubuntu or Debian, and I start using apt, and that like moves so much faster because it's just downloading binary packages. And then I moved over to the Apple computers onto Mac after I abandoned Windows 15, 20 years ago, whatever it was. I got onto using a Mac, and there was no package manager anymore. And I was like, how am I supposed to operate without a package manager? And there was a thing called Mac ports, and I think there was another one. I can't remember the name of the other one, And they tried, but they weren't fast, they weren't reliable, they weren't kept up to date. And then I found Homebrew, and Homebrew is like a total game changer for the Mac. Without Homebrew, I don't think I could be a developer on the Mac platform. And so it's just super, super important for me. It helps me install anything that I need to do my development work. And add to that the fact that Homebrew as an open source project is one of the most welcoming open source projects in the world. The maintainers are awesome. They have a really great code of conduct, contributor guidelines, amazing documentation. They treat it like a real product that has lots and lots of users, and it does have lots of users. And if you go there and you're a total newbie and you try to submit something, they will never yell at you and tell you to go away. They will ask you what you're trying to solve. They'll give you there's automated bots that will ask you questions. Like they've taken this pathway of the things that are terrible. If a human tells you that you did a bad job, it feels bad because someone's insulting you. If a robot tells you that you didn't follow the rules, it's not like the robot is attacking you. It's just that's the robot's job, So they have all that kind of stuff, and I just really love it. I think it's one of the best open source projects out there. And if you're looking for a project to contribute to, I would highly recommend going there and checking that out. So since it sounds like we all love open source, there's lots of great projects out there. Thanks for sharing those. I wanted to go to some questions that came in on the chat. One of the questions that came in was about how often each of us write code. So I'll start. Now that I've founded a company and we have software and technology, I'm writing code every single day. Also, being a coach, helping developers get into things, I'm doing tons of code review, which I actually, in my path as a developer, I think code review is actually something that's one of those things. It's it's not exactly writing code, but it's actually as important, if not more important, than the taking the first pass. It's making sure everything is organized and well manageable and and maintainable. So I'm doing tons and tons of code review every day as well. So how about you two? How are you? How active are you as developers day to day?
I would say neither of us is supposed to be writing code every day, but I find that I end up writing code pretty frequently, at least a couple times a week. I mean, even today, I was debugging a caching issue with one of our API endpoints that needed a little bit of extra love, and it was the Hacktoberfest hug of death, is what I would call that one. But it was great. I was able to get in there. I was able to do performance analysis on an API endpoint, think about our caching strategy, and actually make changes to our code, which ultimately ended up speeding up things by a pretty substantial amount. And I think those problems when they come up they're like puzzles. I love solving those kinds of things, and I've always been a nerd for testing and performance improvement and that kind of stuff. And I know that's really not everybody's cup of tea, but those are definitely mine. And I think I do a lot more work these days, like you said, helping to empower other developers, doing code reviews, writing, documentation, project specs, like doing project management, than I do actually writing code myself. But what I can also say is I'm a big believer in side projects, and I write code in all of my side projects. That's something I do pretty regularly. I find it to be, pretty therapeutic for myself, and that's how I stay up to date on latest tools. And when I'm writing things like Next.js or learning TypeScript, which was my most recent endeavor, I'm doing that usually on a personal project that's related to something I'm interested in. And I try to do those, when I can on weekends and like that kind of stuff. And I've actually been thinking about live streaming my coding. I have not gotten to the point where I'm confident enough yet to do that, but I am thinking about it a little bit.
So I think with the live stream of the coding, I think you just do it. This is the same thing as contributing to open source in a lot of ways. You're afraid, people are afraid to contribute to open source because they're not good enough. And nobody's out to get you, right? The audience of people here, nobody's out here to judge us or give us a hard time. And if they are, you just kind of have to brush them off. But the vast majority of people in technology and in software development, they have similar stories of people taking a chance on them and having, imposter syndrome or feeling like they don't know what they're doing. And they want you to succeed. It's almost most relatable to us, I think, is public speaking. When you get up on stage to do public speaking, nobody's rooting for you to bomb it, right? Everybody wants you to succeed. They came to see a good talk, not a bad talk, right? And so I think the same thing is true about live coding. I think if you just do it, it'll work itself out. I want to talk about a couple technical things. So there's two technical things that each of you brought one thing up, and I want to ask you about it. So Swift, you said LRU caching. Can we talk a little bit about what that is, and just like get into some technical details for fun, and talk about some things? So like, what was that project, and like, why were you implementing LRU caching, and then like, what is LRU caching, and what are the different types of caching?
So LRU caching stands for least recently used caching. Now, I mean, before I get into what that actually is and why it's important, I guess I can talk about caching as a discipline and what it means. So caching is this idea of making information that is going to be need to be accessed quickly, readily available. So as an example, like a real life example of how you might use caching, imagine that you're going to go on a picnic tomorrow during the day at some point. And you're going to pack a picnic basket, and the night before you think, you might make some sandwiches, you're going to bring some chips and things like that. And you go to sleep, and the next day you wake up, and then, it's about half an hour before you have to go for your picnic, and you're like, oh, I need to get that food together. So now you run to the refrigerator, you get everything out, you start like making your sandwiches. Suddenly your ride's here, you're not done packing your picnic basket, and you're in a panic trying to get everything together at the last minute. Now let's go back in time to the night before, when you're planning out what your meals are. A caching strategy is that you might go and gather the supplies that you're going to need for your picnic basket and put them all in one place. So the next day, half an hour before your car ride comes, you're like, oh, I need to get that stuff together for my picnic lunch. And you go to the drawer that you put all the ingredients in advance, and you grab them all out and you use them, and then you put them back where they go. Caching just means that we're taking usually information and just making that more readily available. Mm-hmm. So I can give you a real life example from earlier today. We, as John,
that's a great analogy. I mean,
the real stuff.
Yeah, I love the picnic basket analogy. That's so good.
So real life example. Now let's get into code. As John mentioned before, MOH has a piece of software that we wrote that helps event organizers plan their events. And everybody who's organizing a Hacktoberfest event got access to this software. So when you go to the Hacktoberfest website and you pull up that list of events, all of those events are being powered by this piece of software that MOH wrote. Now, every time you go to that page, the underlying code is actually reaching out to an API endpoint, and it's getting a list of all the events that anybody's organizing, and then it's rendering them on the page as the table. Now, as you can imagine, on the first day of Hacktoberfest, there are a lot of people who want to attend events. So there's a ton of people going to that website, and we're seeing a significant amount of traffic today compared to any other day we've had, which, we only have so many servers running. And basically, people were seeing delays because what was happening is when they were making a request for that web page, the request was being queued, waiting for an available instance to serve the request and return the list of events. So I went into our performance analytics tool. We use a tool called New Relic, and I looked at the API to see why it was being slow. And I could tell that basically what was happening is, we were going to the database, we were getting the list of all the events, and then we were serializing them, which basically just means taking them in one format and converting them into another, into JSON, so that we could return that, and that could be consumed by the Hacktoberfest website. Now,
kind of like filling up your picnic basket.
Yeah, like filling up your picnic basket. It's actually more like transforming.
JSON is the bread, and serialization is the mustard, or
serialization would be like taking all of our raw ingredients and turning them into a sandwich. That's actually serialization here.
Okay, yeah.
So anyway, serialization was taking a long time, and this is where caching came in. So whenever somebody comes to that website, we're getting the same request. We're asking for the request for all the Hacktoberfest events, and we're giving the same response unless there's a new event that's been added. Now, we can use caching here, basically going and prefetching all the information and setting it up so that when somebody requests it, we can return it right away and speed up the response. So what we did was we implemented a cache where we cached the request, and then whenever there's a new event that gets added to the list, we invalidate the cache, delete whatever's in there, and then reset it by refetching the events and then serving that going forward. Now, that's the type of cache that's being used there. We haven't even gotten into, but basically, as you can imagine, when you have lots and lots of requests that you're caching, you can't cache everything, because if you could cache everything, you're just basically recreating, in our picnic basket example, it would basically be like relocating your entire kitchen, right? Like you empty out the fridge just to put the whole fridge in the drawer every time you use it. It's not really a cache at that point. What you're really doing is just making the same amount of work. In fact, you're doing double the work because you're literally just moving everything from one place to another. So implicitly, we want to keep caches small, right? We want to just have the ingredients that we actually need access to. So then the question becomes, how do we actually keep it small? And there's a couple of strategies that you can use for that. And this is where the LRU, least recently used, comes into play, because that's actually one strategy. So the strategy for least recently used, all it means is that we're going to take the item that we cached the least recently, that we cached that we have used the least recently, and we're going to be that's the first thing we're going to put back on the shelf when we need to get it later. So, let's say that we go on a picnic every day, and most days we're eating sandwiches, but some days we might want to have a hot dog instead. Well, I don't put ketchup on my sandwiches. I put ketchup on my hot dogs. And so if it's been a month since I've had a hot dog, well, my ketchup, if I need room in my cache, would be the first thing to go back into the shelf. And so a least recently used cache is just this caching strategy. Again, caching is about prefetching and setting information aside so we can quickly access it. And using a least recently used cache means that we're keeping our cache purposely small. And whenever we run out of space, the first thing we're going to get rid of is something we have not used recently.
That's an awesome explanation. And thanks for doing that on the spot.
No problem.
So
I really appreciate it.
I have to add, because you're using this food analogy, so I used to work in a kitchen as my college job. And when you're doing food safety training, they actually teach you about FIFO caches, which is first in, first out, because you want to use the food that was put in earliest first. And so there's literally a caching system that is like part of food safety training. So there you go. Your analogy was spot on.
It's really funny because the number of things in computer science that are actually just day-to-day problems that you just encounter in your life, it's so high. I mean, another really good example on it is like searching and sorting, right? Everybody has this a junk drawer in their house, right? I've got one right in front of me. This drawer is just full of random stuff that, whenever I need it, whenever I don't have a place to put something, I throw it in there. Now, you could spend all day sorting that drawer and organizing it so that when you open it, you could easily find everything in there. But the reason that that's silly is because the number of times I open this drawer looking for one specific thing, it's like once a year versus like, my fridge, I open up every single day looking for an item. So, sorting is a really expensive process. It takes time to go through a drawer and reorganize everything. The same way it takes time to go through a fridge and organize that. And so, whenever we're going to be searching for something, we need, and we're thinking about like, do we organize in advance and actually sort the items that we're searching through, or do we just, take them and literally go through every single item until we find the one we're looking for? You can honestly think about it in terms of that, right? It's like, how often am I going to be solving this problem, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people prematurely sort, items in their code, whether that's their data that they're working with in their database, or, maybe files, folders, things like that. But, in the same way, in your real life, you would think about whether or not it's worth organizing a drawer or, fridge. You should be thinking about those same kinds of things in your code too. And I think I always love when you can find one of those real world analogies and just apply it to what you're doing. It makes it so much better.
Having been at GitHub for close to 7 years, I taught lots and lots of people about how to use Git. And this will take us into another thing in a little while, but I'll say it now because it's like about analogies. I use this, or metaphors, I don't know. I use this metaphor of Git with your desk. So it's like the thing that people have a hard time understanding about Git is like how the staging area works. And it's especially difficult for people who've used other version control systems before, so like Subversion or version control systems that don't have the staging area. And so I always like to start helping people learn how to use Git with this metaphor of Git is like working on your desk. You have your workspace. That's the folder on your computer that has all your project files in it. Then you have, let's say, a manila folder over on the side, and that's called your staging area. You can copy things from your desk and put it into the staging area. You can take things that are in the staging area and you can throw them away. Right? You can put things in and out. And then you have your drawer in your desk, which is your filing cabinet. And you can close up the folder and put it in your filing cabinet, and that's a commit in your history, right? And I have the same thing. I just love having a tactile way of talking about those things. John, you mentioned a technology term, also an acronym, DSL. What is DSL? And then also, what's it useful for? And like, kind of like why is it a thing? And then also, what are some of your favorite DSLs if you have more than one?
You mean the domain-specific language, not the internet connection I had when I was a kid.
I mean that one too. What is DSL, John? Most of the people might not know what that is. Yeah, no.
when my parents got rid of dial-up and decided to get faster internet, there was this protocol called DSL that was like slightly faster than dial-up.
That's not what
what
we're talking about. Domain-specific languages.
That was 20 years ago. Domain-specific language is kind of a structured language that you define in code that describes a specific like task or set of tasks or configurations. So an example of this is like in the backup library I was talking about earlier, right? There are different domain-specific concepts that are associated with backups. Like maybe you have storage systems or notification systems or compression systems. Your domain-specific language defines not only what each of those is, but how they operate and how you can communicate with them to give you essentially like a sub-language, or really you would call it like a library or an object that you're accessing that controls all of these specific functions. And it's a really, really common concept, right? Like when you are doing Rails development, for example, and you're tapping into a model through Active Record, like Active Record has its own set of DSLs that define how you interact with different models. In the same way that like if you're writing object-oriented code in Java, in many ways, like the code that you're writing around your object is a DSL for that object, right? Like you are creating all of the functions, the variables, the methods that you can communicate with that define specific like operational actions. And I don't have as good of an analogy as Swift here. I mean, I really wish I did, but yeah, it's really a way of kind of sub-defining what is going on with a specific set of functions or tasks.
Yeah, I think one of the like big values of having domain-specific languages is reducing the complexity of your workspace. So, for example, we're both Ruby developers. You could use all of the Ruby language to be your configuration specification for how to use that backup program, or you could define a domain-specific language that has 5 or 6 terms that are effectively do an action whenever a time passes, do an action whenever a file is accessed, do an action whenever another action ends, and you can chain them all together into something that is human readable but also works as code.
And I think the thing that's a little confusing about it is like a domain-specific language really is a set of functions or methods that just do a specific thing. I agree that the point is to make it more human readable. It's not like some fancy programming concept. It's really just a way of describing how you architect your system.
Yeah. Something that I run into a lot with developers that I'm mentoring is that they don't understand what's happening under the hood. And so domain-specific languages are actually something that we spend a lot of time on when we're working together, because, it almost, Ruby on Rails and things that use domain-specific language often come across as magic, right? Yeah. So in Rails, the database migrations framework is a domain-specific language, right? In Rails also, or in Ruby, one of my favorite libraries is RSpec, the testing library. And basically RSpec is a domain-specific language. And you look at the code for that and you like open up a file and it just says, expect thing to be a string. And you're like, how the heck does that even work? Like, how does it know that this variable is supposed to be a string? And also, how does it know to make that a test? And what you said is like, it's actually just calling functions or calling methods. And it's defining cleverly named methods in a certain order and really just breaking it down. I think if anybody has questions about this, submit them on the Helpdesk form and we can go into more detail about it another time. But yeah, thank you so much, John.
The only thing I want to add there is that the magic of a domain-specific language is in how it was designed, not necessarily what the functions do.
Yeah, exactly. It's about, there's also this common pattern that you see, like it's called chaining, like object chaining. So if you build your domain-specific language in such a way that every one of your domain-specific kind of methods always returns an object of the same type, or one of a few different types, you can basically chain and chain and chain and chain method calls. So this is how RSpec works. RSpec has the concept of a matcher, and you basically say expect blank .to, and you pass in a matcher, and then those matchers can be constructed from any of like 100 different keywords or method calls.
Yeah,
which
the
are pretty
best domain
interesting.
specific languages do turn out human readable code.
Yeah, for sure.
They can be taken to an extreme, though. Do you
Yeah,
know what
for
gherkin
sure.
is? The language
What?
gherkin,
Gherkin? Never heard of it.
cucumber. So basically, when I was first getting started with Rails, the hotness at the time was that you would have your business folks write your tests. So they obviously didn't know how to code.
I don't think that ever took off.
It didn't work. This is exactly because this is the extreme of domain specific languages that read like English. So literally, to write the code in Gherkin, you would write English sentences that were then mapped back to code. So you would write something like, when I visit the homepage, then I will see the red box that says click here. When I click here, then I will be taken to the about page. And you'd literally write it in English, and then it would translate it to code. But the problem is it was just so verbose that you literally couldn't tell anything that was going on under the hood. It reads really nicely. It's very pleasant to actually, it's like an essay basically. And I guess if you're not a programmer, you could write it, but it was really tedious and an example of domain specific languages gone awry, to be honest with you.
So I have one more technical question for us before we move on to kind of start wrapping things up. We're all involved in building developer communities, and we have experience like helping people get started, get their skills, improve their skills. And I think that it's likely, I know it's true for me, but I think it's likely true for you all, that there's like one or two particular like issues or technical topics that you're really passionate about and that you teach people about all the time. So I'm like infamous for going on rants about testing, right? But are there any particular things that you're just like super passionate about teaching and you think that are the really valuable things that you want to share with the viewers, about being a programmer, that you commonly give as advice, frequently?
Yeah, so I actually do have something that came to mind immediately. I would say a lot of the teaching that I do happened, at least historically, at hackathons, where someone comes to me for help with a specific problem. And they often leave those situations being like, whoa, you're a genius, every language, right? Because I'm debugging 10 different programming languages in an hour. But the truth is, I don't know any of those languages. I just know how to find solutions to problems. And I would say that is the core skill that I'm most often teaching developers, is actually how to research and solve problems, because that's a discipline that is somewhat intertwined with programming, but actually not the same thing at all. And a lot of junior developers, I think, fall into this trap where they try to solve their own problems purely by looking at the code or the documentation or the core library that they're using. And they don't know how, or they aren't confident actually Googling around for answers and sifting what looks good versus what might not be applicable to their situation. And so that's what I often coach people through. I think that the simplest way to start with that, and this, I think people who are really familiar, it almost sounds over simple, is to copy and paste the error that you have into Google. But people don't know to do that, right?
But it has to be exact, error number, everything.
Error number, everything. And that leads you down a rabbit hole where you might get a million responses and have to be able to figure out which one's applicable to your situation, right? Stack Overflow is a fantastic resource for that. I think occasionally you find blog posts that solve problems in a specific way. And as you Google those, solutions, you find more and more ways to describe your problem that bring up the results you want.
Pro tip on that blog post thing. When I first got started doing software development, I actually made a blog, and I set a mission for myself to blog at least once a month. And I would always write blog posts whenever I had an issue that I found that was really hard to figure out, and I had to solve it. And I talked to somebody, but being the person who writes that one blog post that solves that issue that 10,000 people in the world have, but nobody's written about it yet, you end up at the top of the search engine results, when that happens. And it's really fun when that works out. And it's not like you have to have a very hard issue to solve. It's just you have to have a unique issue, right? It's kind of like the long tail. So how about Swift? Do you have any particular issues that you're really keen on teaching when you're working with developers?
I do a lot of teaching about tests. I'll be honest. I think that's probably like the one that I end up doing the most of. I think, I was gonna think of another one though that.
I mean, you can talk about tests. I won't talk about mine.
I won't steal your thunder here. I'll let you do that at some point here. I think you'll probably have many more things to say about tests than I do. But yeah, I think something that I often will come back to as well is just making sure that you've really got a good developer environment set up. I think one of the things that is tremendously undervalued is really fully understanding and having a consistent environment that you can come back to time and time again and use. And back when I was in school, we had this saying among the hackathon club I was a part of that thou shalt not impose thy dot files on novice developers. And the reason we had that was because every single person in the club loved to explain their developer environment setup to every new person. And then suddenly their environment setup would be on the new person's computer, and then no one would have any idea how to use it because it was so But one of the best exercises I always go through with people is like actually talking about the tools they use, right? Like what's their text editor or IDE of choice? Are they doing things like having specific keywords or aliases that they're using for common practices, for common things they're doing every day? Are they doing backups or like those kinds of automated tasks that are going to just make their lives generally easier? How are you managing dependencies, right? Like, are you installing all your libraries system wide, or are you versioning them by project? Things like that. And I think it's something that people just like, especially when they're getting started, assume it's magic. But the truth is, like, if you understand the tools you use, you're going to be better equipped to be successful with them. And the real world analogy I'd use here is, when I was growing up, we always had a tool chest in our garage, right? Whenever something would break or something, we'd like go out and get tools and we'd fix it. Now, at first I would just get something that looked like it would work, and I would have at it and see how it went. But over time, I familiarized myself with all the tools and what they actually did. And when I had a specific problem that there's a specific tool to deal with, it ultimately made your lives a lot easier. And a really classic example of that is I was doing a basement renovation like at the beginning of the summer, and we had to rip up some carpet. Well, you could take a pair of scissors and you could try to cut the carpet, but I promise you that's going to be really rough to do, and your hands are going to be all cut up. There's a specific knife called a carpenter's knife that you actually can use to cut carpet. It's got a fancy hook in it so that you get under the carpet and you pull and you can just walk and cut the whole thing. And understanding how to use it and what it does and what it's for, enables you to do the job better and faster. And the same thing's true of your developer environment, right? If you understand why you're installing, Vim versus Emacs, or why you're, using grep or awk, and you can understand the advantages of those and what they're applicable for, like you're just going to be more effective and happier when you're solving problems and on your development machine.
For sure.
Can you show me how to exit Vim?
WQ.
Command. Just close your computer. Restart. Just hold down the restart button.
RMRF/.
Yeah. So when we were doing the pilot with Raise, Raise.dev, one of the first things that we did with everybody was had them wipe their computers back to fresh. And then we taught them how to build their own .file setup. So we didn't impose our .file on them, but we basically had devs, install all the libraries themselves, understand what path is, understand how the command line works. It's surprising how many people can go through like a coding boot camp or even a university degree and come out and not understand exactly what's happening when they type a command on the terminal. So I think understanding your tools is a really, really good tip. And if there's ever any kind of tools, like we can always talk about that stuff. Our coaches can help you with it. So feel free to like bring those kinds of questions to us. So I think that the last thing that I would say related to John, what you were talking about is the just-in-time learning. I talk to a lot of developers, and they expect that they're going to learn the skills so that they can do the job, and like. The reality check here is that if you're going to be a developer, you need to be comfortable with not knowing what the hell is going on always, right? Like pretty much 100% of your job is like show up to work and have a problem that you don't know how to solve, staring you in the face, and you have to try to figure it out. If that's not what you love doing, you should really consider like trying to get a mindset shift to be okay with that, because it's the reality of the situation. Because if we had a solution to the problem, like if any developer just knew the solution, it would be done already, right? Like there'd be a library for it, and we would just download it and install it. So, get comfortable with being stuck behind hard problems all the time and learn to love it, right? It's like, you might not like eating, spinach or your greens or whatever, but eventually you learn how to do it when you become an adult. As a developer, you might get really, really frustrated staring at that screen with the errors all the time, but you just have to learn to embrace it and be used to it. I guess before we wrap up, John and Swift, are there any other topics that you feel like you want to share or talk about, on the stream?
I mean, a couple of things I just want to call out that I think would be really useful for anybody who's participating in Hacktoberfest, this month. I know there's a lot of you out there who are doing that. First and foremost, there are a ton of great events just like this one that are all on the Hacktoberfest schedule. You probably came here from that event schedule, but I do want to call out that new events are getting added every single day. I know the Raise Dev team is adding like 30 events right now. So, keep checking back and seeing if there's other things you'd be interested in. I know the MOH team is running some events, and I know that, there's tons of people all over the world who are doing that as well. It's a lot easier to get started on something like open source when you've got other awesome people to do it with. The second thing I'll call out is that we at MOH have an event coming up called Local Hack Day, which is happening towards the end of the month. I think it's maybe the second or third week in October here, or third or fourth week in October here, rather. But the idea is that we have basically a virtual developer conference that's focused on all kinds of skills that'll be applicable in your journey as an engineer or software developer. Everything from how to get started on Git and GitHub, which is really relevant right now with Hacktoberfest, to how to deploy your apps on places like DigitalOcean, or maybe get started with the blockchain or whatever else you might want to learn. We have something like 200 workshops that week, which it represents, I think, 300 hours of content, and it's happening in basically every time zone. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. It's localhackday.moh.io if you're looking for the website there. And then the last thing I'd say is if you enjoy Hacktoberfest and you're looking for other ways to get involved in open source, we run this program called the MOH Fellowship that the three of us have talked about a bunch here. All of us are involved in helping developers learn how to gain the skills they need to level up and grow as software engineers by contributing to open source. Rather than just doing it for a month, you could do it for 12 weeks with a whole slew of other awesome people, all under the guidance of awesome expert mentors like the three of us here. It's a lot of fun, and we have another batch coming up in the spring and the summer, and applications for both of those are open right now. But I think those are the big things I would want to call out, and just want to wish everybody a good luck with Hacktoberfest this month.
Yeah, so this is our Hacktoberfest October 1st kickoff. I hope that you all get out there and make some pull requests. Feel free to as you start making pull requests and you open them, if you get stuck along the way, we'll be here all month. We're doing this stream 3 times a day on every weekday, 4 p.m. local time, Indian Standard Time, Central European Standard Time, and Eastern Daylight Time, 4 p.m. 3 times a day, Monday through Friday. And we're looking forward to answering your questions, doing the live coding streams. This is our kickoff. We haven't done like any live coding yet, but we'll be doing some live coding and things like that as well. So get out there, start hacking, start submitting pull requests, and when you get stuck, bring them back to us, and we'll be happy to help you work through them. And I think that's everything for today. So I just want to say thank you to our guests, Mike Swift and John G. I guess just Swift, but from MLH.
Who's Mike?
Yeah, who's Mike, right? But yeah, that's it for today. So I think Joe's going to come back on and run us out through the end of the show. But thank you both very much for coming.
Thank you,
Awesome. Thanks, John.
Bye, guys.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you so much for being here with us today. That is our last show for today. As John said, we will be back tomorrow. Just occurred to me that I muted my mic, so yeah, cool, you can hear me. We will be back tomorrow with more shows. I've just tweeted out the schedule at Raise Devs, so you can find the schedule there, but we'll run through that quickly now. So at the first show of the day, we have on 4 p.m. Indian Standard Time, we have Eddie joining us. Eddie, I think, has been in the chat, actually. Eddie, are you still here? Eddie's been in the chat all day. He'll be joining us tomorrow, our first show of the day, 4 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 12:30 p.m. Central European Time. Next up, we have Ching Ching Liu. I'm actually super excited for that show. Ching Ching is a alumni of the Raise.dev pilot, and she will be with us at 4 p.m. CEST, 10 a.m. EDT. So not only going to be a great show to continue visiting the topics that we've spoken about today, people's developer journeys, open source, getting into open source and Hacktoberfest. But if you have any questions about Raise.dev and what Raise.dev was like for someone who has been through the program before, that would be a great time to show up. And then finally, at the end of the day, we have Will Russell joining us. That is at the show for this time slot. So the 10 p.m. CEST, 4 p.m. EDT, you'll be able to find everything there. So just a brief link dump before I set you all on your way. Just a reminder that we are here all October with your questions. If you have questions that are big or small, whether they are high level, how do I get into Hacktoberfest, or all the way through to I have a particular issue and I'm stuck with this library, this framework, this error, you can submit those to the raise.dev/Hacktoberfest site. We have a form there where you can tell us about the problem you've got, link us to the issue or pull request, and even link us to your fork or branch, and we'll get in there and check that out for you and send those questions over to one of our expert guests, and we'll line that up on the show. If you submit a question on there, we will let you know when we're going live with your question, and after the show, if you can't make it, we'll send you a recording of the answer. So you will definitely get the answers for the questions that you ask on there as soon as we get them on the show. Next up, if you just want to continue watching these lovely shows, you can catch our full schedule at twitch.tv RaiseDev's schedule. That's updated week by week, so you can see the schedule for tomorrow there right now, and over the weekend we'll get the schedule for the next week up there as well. And then just a final reminder, if you are interested in coaching to reach the next step of your career, you can find us at raise.dev and get you can go through our application there to have your kickoff call with a coach and get you on your way to your next goal. So that is everything from me. Thank you again for joining us today. We will see you in the chat tomorrow, and have a lovely evening.